Well, welcome to ICLEI Oceania Listens. My name is Martin Brennan. I'm Director of Partnerships and Political Support for ICLEI Oceania. Very pleased to have today Wayne Wescott, former CEO and Regional Director of ICLEI Oceania, to talk to us about his time at ICLEI. Welcome, Wayne.
Hi, Martin.
Look, you've obviously spent quite a bit of time working with ICLEI, in fact since its foundation back in 1997. Can you tell us just what were the drivers behind ICLEI Oceania back in those days?
Well, I think the first thing would be that a group like ICLEI really couldn't have existed without, paradoxically, globalisation. So here's a group that works in local backyards, what we do locally in our own libraries and neighbourhood centres and local recycling systems. And yet we are an international, ICLEI is an international organisation and has a very global perspective. So I think for the first time in the 90s, the combination of changes to the nation states, the need for cooperation around things like climate change and of course the internet and growing communications meant that an ICLEI became possible. In Australia, I think in particular, we had a very nice congruence of interest amongst cities and councillors, senior managers in the large environmental issues of that time.
Right, and so you're saying that there was a sort of a global international driver as well as at a local level there was a sense in which mayors and councillors and managers, senior managers, wanted to actually work on the issues around sustainability, climate change. What were the agendas that those councils seemed to express at the time?
Well, I think climate change became clearly from the 90s through to this decade that we're nearing the end of now. I would say cities have been one of the sectors of all of our community that has been most on the front foot on climate change. And if you look in the longer term, you'd say the 90s was the time when we marshalled the case. The first decade, the noughties as we say, has been the time when cities have become listened to by other agencies, and I think as you and I know from our experience in our region in particular, groups like the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, international organisations, multilateral agencies are very interested and excited with what cities are doing. And I think the next decade that we're about to go into will be the decade of implementation with cities on the ground, and I find that's a very exciting agenda.
Well, given over 12 years, that's a reasonable time span. Clearly there are elections, there's changes in councils, there's changes in federal and state governments. Can you tell me, were there changes over that time in terms of the way ICLEI Oceania worked with local governments in Australia?
Well, I think in many ways we've always tried to identify the difficult task of taking a very complex problem and turning it into something simple. But there's a difference between simple and simplistic. Simplistic to me loses the complexity. So what we've tried to do at all times is have a dialogue which maintains that complexity. This is very easy to say, very difficult to do, as you well know. So I think early on our dialogue was we had lots of science-based arguments. You and I stood up in many town halls around this country and debated the science of climate change. Interestingly enough, that debate is now coming back in some quarters, and I find that an interesting swing of the cycle, because certainly 5 years ago we weren't having those scientific debates. I think the way that local governments, our approach to local governments was all about building capacity, and it would be fair to say, I think, that in those 12 years that we've been working, and all the staff who worked with ICLEI over those 12 years have been working with our councils, that the local governments themselves took this on as an issue. So suddenly the General Assembly at ALGA becomes a very important lynching point for strong words on climate change. Local governments are recognised globally. Our leading cities are recognised for their work on climate change. So I think it'd be fair to say now, as we enter this next decade, that our local governments are ready for the next steps.
And given the obvious success of the work over the 12 years, what lessons have you learned, and you believe ICLEI Oceania has learned, in terms of the way that it's been able to work with councils? Are there any clear messages or lessons that can be learned from that 12 years of experience?
Okay, well I think there's a lot of lessons. I think there's a couple of core things, some methodological and some content. So I think methodology, ICLEI has, I think, put right front and central the notion that you have to develop a robust business case for sustainability. One of the things, now we all recognise that there's a great role for people who are simply enthusiastic and want to do this work for the good of the work itself, and I think we celebrate that. But we also recognise that investing in sustainability is a case that one has to make in amongst the white noise of competing demands and the competition for budgets and attention. And my view would be that ICLEI has been very good at building that approach up, and I think I hear that reflected back to me now. So that's a very powerful thing. I think in terms of content, I think that we've probably broken through the idea that climate change is an international global issue. It is, of course, but it pops up its head in our backyards in this very place here, all around the world. So what we've discovered is that we can translate a global issue, climate change, and turn that into something that makes sense to local governments. And as we have often said, we've helped to identify that role. I think we've helped to play that role effectively to this point, though I think there's a long way to go. But that second point of really focusing on the role that local governments can play in a global issue has been critical for the global debate on climate change.
Now, of course, you're moving on now after 12 years at the helm of ICLEI Oceania. Can I ask you what you think ICLEI Oceania might look like in 12 years' time?
You didn't suggest that question to me? Okay, in 12 years' time. Okay, goodness, so heading into the third decade of this century. Well,
what sort of organisation do you think we could and might be?
Look, my view is that if we look at the big arc, say, of climate change first, so let's look at content areas. Next decade is going to be a decade in which local governments, cities in particular, the urban component of local governments will be a critical implementation focus. And I get that. I'm doing some work with the International Energy Agency at the moment, and I'm getting that reflected back very much strongly from those sort of people. So I would expect that if ICLEI plots its path through that, firstly, that there will be a continued role in implementation. I personally believe that the broad movement and the planet needs organisations like ICLEI to be one step ahead, as it clearly is with the Safe and Healthy Communities work that ICLEI is doing in the early days of it. It seems to me very much that the broad notion of sustainable development that it encompasses is a very powerful one, and I think the methodologies and the linkages with the strong environment areas that it provides are very exciting. I think the move from mitigation to become an umbrella approach to resilience, which again ICLEI, it seems to me, is a pioneer in, is going to be very exciting, and I hope that over the next decade, in the same way that ICLEI has created and mentored a movement of local governments around reducing climate change impacts, ICLEI can also create a movement of local governments that are on the front foot in building more resilient communities. So in 12 years' time, hard to pick where things may be. The local government sector, of course, is there forever. It's a shocking concept, and there we are. It's there forever, and I would hope that ICLEI and its role working with local government associations, directly with its members, but also with that broad group of stakeholders, partners, etc., that I think ICLEI is now developing very strongly, and I know you yourself have pushed very hard here. I think that it seems to me that the future is there to be written if ICLEI wants to be a part of it.
Well, look, it's very good to speak to you. We obviously, with 12 years of experience at working with ICLEI Oceania and having taken ICLEI Oceania to where it is today, we certainly thank you. We look forward to working with you in your various capacities in the future. And so, from ICLEI Oceania Listens, thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you.